and I will be facilitating the first part of this meeting. First, I'd like to share a few points on housekeeping. Please turn off your cameras, except when you will speak, and turn off your microphones, please. We will record the event, and we will share the recording and resources that can help in your work after the event. And you're welcome to use the chat during the webinar, but we will only monitor what is written and the questions in the question and answer session. We have interpretation via an app called Interprefy, and to access the interpretation from English to Spanish and from Spanish to English, please follow the instructions in the chat. Today we have one Spanish speaker in the second segment, so everyone who needs the interpretation from Spanish to English must use the Interprefy app. And I apologize in advance if I have to interrupt you in the interest of time, and in order to give everybody a fair chance to speak. So, having said that, this webinar today is the second and the final webinar in our series on human rights actors and fisheries. I'm really happy to see that we have many participants that were with us yesterday as well. And in today's webinar, we will focus particularly on the role of the international human rights mechanisms and the important role that they play in identifying gaps and providing guidance and recommendations to countries on how to address human rights in the fisheries sector. The mandate of the international human rights monitoring mechanisms is to monitor how states are implementing their international obligations. The results of their monitoring activities are captured in outcome documents that have a wealth of qualitative information on the status of implementation of the rights, and that are often roadmaps of proposed suggestions and measures for addressing the gaps. These mechanisms also provide important guidance through general comments, communications, and reports, depending on the mandate of the mechanism. Today, we're going to hear specifically experiences from some of the key United Nations human rights mechanisms that have engaged on the issue of the human rights of small-scale fisheries, and their communities: the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, the UN Committee on the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls. And we will explore opportunities for enhancing collaboration with these mechanisms. So without further ado, I would like to start off the first panel. We will explore the important experiences of both United Nations treaty bodies and special procedures of the Human Rights Council in how they've addressed the human rights issues facing small-scale fishers, fish workers, and their communities. We will examine how the guidance that these mechanisms have developed can be used and strengthened to further the protection of the human rights of small-scale fishers, fish workers, and their communities. And it's my pleasure to introduce you to our first speaker, Mr. Michael Winfor, Vice Chair of the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So welcome to this virtual panel, Mr. Winfor. Mr. Michael Winfor has been a member of the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights since 2016. This committee is a United Nations treaty body mechanism that is mandated to monitor the implementation of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. The committee assesses the degree to which countries that have ratified the covenant are meeting their obligations under the treaty, including in relation to several human rights considered of key importance for small-scale fishers, fish workers, and coastal communities. Welcome, Mr. Winfor, and I'd like to ask you, could you please provide us with some concrete examples of how the committee addresses human rights and fisheries, including any ways in which the committee plans to engage more on this issue in the future? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, and hello, and good afternoon, or good morning or evening, wherever you might look at us. The committee is checking the performance of 171 states at the moment who have ratified this covenant. So it's close to universal ratification. And I have just looked the last days into maybe many of our concluding observations where we have worked with the small-scale fishery problems or fisher problems at all. And maybe I cluster them briefly into 6 different areas, which has been maybe identified by our committee as being important. Yeah, we have at least in 4 cases discussed with countries that there is a depletion of fishing resources in front of their coastal lines because maybe foreign companies or foreign treaties or treaties with other states allow other persons to fish in the region. It has been with Djibouti in 2013 or the Philippines 2016, Kenya 2016 with the East African Community of States agreement with the European Union, or Senegal, where the EU fishing fleets are depleting the coastal area. So this has been the first area where foreign and the state is not adequately protecting the people living in that country and living from fishing. A second theme which has been taken up has been child labor in the fishing sector. So we had cases from Jamaica 2013, Indonesia, Thailand and Sri Lanka in the last years where we have addressed this issue. A third area where we have worked with was working conditions on fishing vessels. So we had cases, or we have taken up the issue related to Thailand and South Korea in 2015 and 2017. We have discussed the fourth issue, the total neglect of fishing communities in maybe national development policies. We had it, for example, with the Democratic Republic of Congo, or we had a fifth area where issues where the military was, let's say, destroying access of fishing communities to the coastline and to their traditional fishing and grounds. We had this, for example, in Sri Lanka 2017, or maybe with Israel and access of fishing communities in the Gaza Strip. And we had the issue of, that's our last point, where national regulations were affecting the rights of indigenous fishing populations. And we had cases, for example, in Norway 2013, in Russia 2017, or Finland 2021. So it already shows you that's a variety of different issues which has been taken up by the committee, and we don't have the strategy. We take it up from the reports which we receive. So what I can already say, any encouragement of fishing communities or civil society organizations or national human rights organizations to inform us about these type of problems, because that would allow us to bring this to the attention of states in the, let's say, dialogue we have with that state, and maybe take it up also in our concluding observations. It gives you an indication that sometimes we are related to the right to food or the right to an adequate standard of living when it is about income, but we sometimes also relate it to working conditions. It would be the fair and just working conditions, which is another article of our covenant. And sometimes we even relate it to, let's say, fishing rights in general of fishing communities, yeah, like threatened by new legislation against indigenous communities or by military. And we have also the case that the foreign extraterritorial obligations are hit when foreign countries are maybe depleting the fishing grounds in front of a country. So that gives you a variety of things we have worked with. And I just want to mention that we also have the opportunity to draft general comments. So that would be interpretative notes of our covenant, how it should be read in conjunction with certain issues. And we have not yet a general comment on the rights of small-scale fisheries, but we have a general comment made on the right to food, adequate food, where fishing is also covered. We have also a new general comment on land, where we have access to land and fishing resources mentioned. And we are currently working also on a general comment on the impact of sustainable development and economic, social, and cultural rights, where we are considering that we have to discuss much more on the issue of fishing resources, the sustainability of, let's say, using access to the resources and also to use the resources continuously. So that has been maybe some first ideas, and I think I haven't overstretched my 5 minutes, which you have given to me.
Thank you very, very much. You went right on time, and thank you for giving us this broad overview of the work of the committee relating to small-scale fishers and the invitation that you give to civil society, to communities, to NHIs to engage with the committee and informing it so that you have the information when you come to the dialogue with the countries. And congratulations on your new general comment on land, and also for this invitation to contribute to your new upcoming general comment on the impact of sustainable development. Thank you. I'll come back to you. I would like to continue giving a warm welcome to Mr. Michael Fakhri, our next speaker, who is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food. Warm welcome to you, sir. Mr. Fakhri, the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, has been a key UN special procedure addressing the issue of human rights and fisheries, particularly through the mandate's thematic reports on the sector from as early as 2004 to its latest report. The mandate can also carry out country visits to assess gaps in implementation in specific national context, and can issue communications to states urging them to address specific issues. Mr. Fakhri, I'd like to ask you, what are some of the key concerns raised by your mandate as far as the right to food and fisheries is concerned? And are there emerging issues that you as Special Rapporteur would like to have more focus on in the future with regard to this sector? Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Harumi, and thank you, everyone. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm just going to build on what Michael Winford has said, and just sort of there'll be obvious overlap. So every mandate holder on the right to food has addressed the issue of fisheries and the right to food. I'm the fourth mandate holder as a special rapporteur on the right to food, and I'll be writing my report this year on fisheries in light of the conclusion of the International Year of Artisanal Fisheries and Aquaculture. So I hope we can continue this conversation, and everyone can use this report that I'll be writing in 1 year from now to sort of focus states' attention on the issue of fisheries and put whatever they believe and are the most important issues from their perspective. As Harumi noted, other things that different groups can do is you can send to me allegations of human rights violations over the next year, or the entire mandate, but the next year, most importantly, because it will also really inform that final report and shed light on issues. And my first country visit, it's been a challenge, obviously, due to the pandemic, but my first country visit is, we haven't finalized the exact time, but it will be in May sometime, and it will be to South Africa. And the reason I was keen on visiting South Africa, one reason was because of the fisher communities in South Africa. So to continue encouraging their countries to accept the visitations of special rapporteurs is something people can do. So not only have mandate holders focused on fisheries, but of course, there have been many normative developments around human rights and fisheries. The most notable, as many people will know here, are the voluntary guidelines for securing sustainable and small-scale fisheries, and the UN Declaration on Peasants and Other People Working in Rural Areas. So if you take all of this together, the issue of fisheries is a right to food issue because fisheries provide food for a large number of people, but also because fisheries are a source of livelihood for not just coastal communities, but everyone sort of that depends on fisheries. One of the biggest challenges that fisherfolk continue to face is the struggle for access to water and access to land. And that's something I'll continue to focus on. Moreover, fishery workers face unique and acute problems. Fishery workers have been described by the fishery work has been described by the International Labour Organization as dirty, dangerous, and difficult. And fishery workers often have little or no minimum wage provisions in law. They work very long hours. They have limited opportunities for collective bargaining, and they lack social protection. And then amongst fisherfolk and fishery workers, women, children, migrants, and indigenous peoples tend to be the most exploited and abused. So when I'm talking about fisherfolk and fishery workers, it's not just livelihoods and access to food. What is at stake is people's culture. their sense of who they are as a people. What is at stake is people's socio-ecological relationship with fish and marine life more broadly. So, of course, the biggest threats to fish stocks are industrial fishing, marine pollution, and climate change. And these all stem from an assumption that our relationship with nature is transactional and exploitative. This stems from an assumption that nature is a source of commodities. What fisher folk understand is that our relationship with marine life is reciprocal. People are part of marine life just as much as underwater flora and fauna are part of marine life. You cannot have one without the other. In fact, the other challenge that fisher folk and fishery workers face are conservation efforts that look to protecting biodiversity by excluding people in a very blunt way, dispossessing them of their territorial rights without any consultation or consent. So in my report, what I hope to do is focus on fisher folk and coastal communities and fishery workers as stewards of our waters and seas, to recognize that we cannot enhance underwater biodiversity without enhancing fisher folk and coastal communities' human rights. And the idea would be to identify those actors that have overfished and polluted our waters, and those actors that have exploited fishery workers, so that those actors can be held accountable. I'll end just very quickly on the matter of global inequality must also be addressed, meaning the inequality between countries. And so I'll continue focusing on the WTO in light of the recent negotiations in Geneva. They came to an agreement which was commendable after all these years, but unfortunately, the agreement at the WTO does very little to address declining fish stocks and enable large-scale transitions to more sustainable practices. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for this sharing information of your plans for 2023. I really hope that everyone takes this open invitation to contribute to your report. And also, as you mentioned, the allegations of human rights violations at the national, regional, and local level is very important. And thank you. I think this last point that you mentioned is a key objective of this webinar series. It's really to strengthen the synergy of the fisher folk with the work of the United Nations human rights mechanisms that already provide for an accountability framework at the international level, as well as to take advantage of your guidance and your information and data. Thank you very much, and we'll come back to you again. And now, apologies. Now I'd really like to welcome Ms. Dorothy Strada-Tank, Chair of the United Nations Discrimination Against Women and Girls. Very warm welcome to you, Mrs. Strada-Tank. The working group of which Mrs. Strada-Tank is chair, the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls is one of the UN special procedures. It has the mandate to address the elimination of discrimination against women in law and in practice in all fields based on state obligations to respect, protect, and fulfill women's human rights. So very warm welcome. And I'd like to ask you a question divided into two. Some studies suggest that women make up about half of the global fisheries workforce, typically, but not only, concentrated in the pre-harvest and post-harvest sectors. In this regard, if you could share in the experience of the working group, what are the types of human rights issues that women face in this sector, and how can the guidance and the work of the working group help address these issues at the national level, both now and in the future? And what guidance has the working group already provided that could be useful to address gender discrimination and abuses in the fisheries sector? And if you could share any opportunities that you see for mainstreaming this issue more into your work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diana, and also previous colleagues, because I think we share concerns that have been reflected in the work of the working group, and that we also wish to incorporate even more in our current and future work. As mentioned before, the working group, as one of the UN Human Rights Special Procedures, issues, as other colleagues, annual thematic reports. It carries out country visits, and it also issues communications to states when we have identified that there are violations, credible allegations of violations to human rights of women and girls, including in the area of fisheries. And so through these three functions, the reports, country visits, and communications, we have documented a series of challenges and human rights violations that particularly women and girls face, apart from what has already been referred to, in the sense that there are certain gendered impacts that we see. As Diana was mentioning, yes, women form about half of the small-scale fisheries and marine fishery activities. However, the working group has identified that much of this participation is invisible, it's not acknowledged, it is not recognized, and this has an impact in the everyday realization or not of human rights on the ground. And so this is also observable in the sense that women and girls do not have participation, or a very low participation in decision-making power. So there is not a coherent or an equivalent representation of how much they mean to these activities and these forms of livelihood, to the decisions that are taken in these sectors in terms of the national and even international economies, as Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food was mentioning in terms of, for example, trade rules at the global level. The working group has also documented unsafe working conditions, the lack of capital accessible to women for different products that are useful for their fishery activities. And so there are specific reports that may be useful to the audience that have documented in detail some of these challenges. For instance, and I'll go from some of the most recent backwards, in its report of 2020 in Women in the Changing World of Work, the effect of neoliberal economic models was documented, and its specific impact on women and girls in fishery activities. In the 2018 report on reaffirming gender equality and countering rollbacks, we also documented part of these challenges. In 2017, the working group issued a report on good practices. So apart from identifying challenges, part of our mandate is also to help states and national human rights institutions, other actors as addressed in this webinar, to be able to counter discrimination against women and girls. And there are some good practices in this area. And before that, in the first years of the working group, which was created in 2010, the report on economic and social life, 2014, and on political participation in public life also document part of these challenges. And in terms of country visits, I would like to mention the visit that the working group carried out actually some months ago, only in April, in September, to the Maldives, where the working group documented that the loss of islands and lagoons due to climate change was also having an impact on these traditional forms of life in which women and girls participate in fishery activities. And that, of course, this has an impact in terms of the realization of many of their economic, social rights, in terms of access to right to food, right to water, right to housing, and really that the contribution of women in this sector it should be much better acknowledged. And so this is one of the challenges we face. I would just like to end and also building on synergies, which I understand is one of the objectives of this webinar, and thinking of what my previous colleagues have referred to. The annual thematic report of this year of the working group is focused on women and girls in the context of poverty and inequality. So we are dealing with the cross-cutting factors of gender inequality and socioeconomic inequality, the disproportionate impacts of poverty on women and girls, but also, as Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food was mentioning, global inequality and how this affects women and girls. So we would really look forward to future exchanges in this area, and we hope that this report will be also useful to try to uphold women's and girls' rights in the area of fisheries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for all those resources that we will share with all the participants, because they're extremely important. You mentioned the good practices that can be replicated in other countries, and you reiterated some of the messages of how women can be the stewards and can bring solutions into the challenges that they face, but that they traditionally have not been given the space and the decision-making power on an equal basis with others. So thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation also for participants to contribute to your reports. I would like to come back to all three speakers with one question, common question for all of you, and I'll give you 2 minutes to answer. We have heard how you have all engaged in this issue and the opportunities that you see for future engagement. Can you please tell us a little bit more about the challenges that you currently face in your dialogues with states and with states parties on this issue, and the possibilities that you see for NHRIs and other actors and other environmental human rights defenders in general, to support your work in general? Thank you very much. Can we please start with Ms. Estrada Tank? Oh, apologies, Mr. Winford, you're ready. Please go ahead, Mr. Winford.
Okay, I thought you would go in the same order, but you could also have done the different way. Well, a committee like ours is dealing with several states every year, 16, 18 states. So we are really depending on getting good information. And the current process of T2 body reform is heading towards, let's say, a list of issues prior to reporting drafted by committees. So we will need really good information from civil society and national human rights institutions on the issue. And if you have issues in the fishing sector, it's very important that you address us with a short report. It doesn't mean it must be necessarily very long, but it indicates that problems, human rights problems related to fishery is really an important issue in the state. And it's also interesting or important to say who is maybe responsible for this type of, let's say, violations which are happening, because it allows also to address different actors. As you have seen, we are normally addressing the state party which is under report. And if, for example, Senegal has an agreement with the European Union getting some money for allowing European fishing vessels to deplete the, let's say, the ocean before the coast, this is partially also a human rights obligation or violation organized by the European Union. It could be taken up also when we are dealing with European states. But in this case, we have dealt with this under the, let's say, responsibility of Senegal, and we discussed it as a violation of the obligation to protect their own fishing folk against this type of negative influence. And I think that is depending then from the perspective. We might also raise these issues when there would be a report dealing with maybe some European members who have big fishing fleets going to African countries, for example, depleting oceans. That could also be possible. So we have to differentiate very carefully what is in the realm of the national government and their responsibilities for which we can hold them accountable when doing the concluding observation. Maybe just to add, the issues of, let's say, changing environment, like climate change now affecting the availability of fishing resources or pollution of oceans are extremely important. The special rapporteur has mentioned this. And for us, we have to address this also more systematically. Therefore, we are writing this general comment on, let's say, economic, social, cultural rights and sustainable development, which has to deal with maybe the issue that resources which we have on a planet with limited resources needs to be distributed in a, let's say, most equal or just format. And this is something extremely important fish is one of the most depleted resources and has a lot of problems. And it's very important to reconsider what does it mean to talk about access to fish, to fishing resources, how to use them, and to relate this also to the income of fishing communities or their rights. And I think the important elements here has to do also with the limited nature of the resources, but also the right of those who are currently living from this, having an income, that there's not forgotten when these resources might be distributed in any national or international agreement. So we have to be very careful. What does it mean having a resource which can easily be depleted on a limited planet, but we have also users which needs to be protected. To find a good balance on this, we are reflecting when we are drafting this general comment. This is not only an issue for fishing resources, also for others, but it's a particular issue also at that level. So maybe this some of the challenges we see. And again, my cordial invitation to you, take the committee's work, the opportunity also that we are checking your states and that we can grill them or ask questions systematically and send us information list of issues which we can raise, and also give us information where we should focus, where the largest problems. And this is a call for civil society organizations, but also for indigenous peoples organizations or for national human rights institutions. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Mr. Fakhri, please.
Thank you. First, I'll just start very broadly. As everyone probably realizes, we're in the midst of not just a pandemic, but a food crisis. And the challenge for me over the last 2.5, 3 years has been making sure that the right to food is a central feature in how national governments and international institutions understand and respond to the food crisis. And it's been a very difficult struggle. At the beginning, but there's good news. At the beginning of the pandemic, human rights was actually was absent, and then it was sort of marginalized. It was there, but in the margins of international discussions. As of this year, I find that the right to food has become central to many conversations in international forums. So that's the result of a long campaign and struggle by civil society organizations, by social movements. So finally, the right to food is on the international agenda broadly in light of the food crisis. So that, however, makes me wonder how comfortable are national governments, how comfortable they are talking about fisheries as a matter of human rights and not just commerce and conservation. So I suspect it'll continue to be an uphill battle, making sure that the discussion about human rights and fisheries is not just with the human rights component of governments, but across the entire government, frame the issue in terms of human rights. And the other challenge is that fishery issues are, of course, inherently transboundary, whereas human rights remains very dependent on national institutions. So in my report, I want to keep thinking about how to consult and collaborate with national human rights institutions, of course, in a way that's regional, looking for opportunities for national human rights institutions to also collaborate regionally. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, you're right about this transboundary nature of fisheries. We see it also with water and water resources, transboundary waters. Thank you. Ms. Estrada Tank, please. You have the floor.
Thank you so much. The working group has different challenges ahead that we see in this area, and in which we can find, I think, ways to collaborate. The working group has documented that part of the socioeconomic exclusion, social injustices that affect women in fisheries also stem from gender inequality in other areas. So we know that particularly for women and girls, gender inequality in family and cultural life, in access to sexual and reproductive health rights is particularly interdependent and correlated to the realization of all human rights, including economic and social rights in this area. So while we do not tackle gender-based discrimination and inequalities in this integral and wholesome way, it will be very hard to address the issue and the root causes of this, because what we have seen is some forms of isolated approaches, and we also see the risk of gender backlash that has been documented in the last few years. So this obviously impacts directly on women's economic empowerment, and in the area of fisheries and traditional forms of life, this may be the case as well, or this has been the case as well. We have elevated these concerns to states. You were asking about the interaction with states. We have done this with member states at the Human Rights Council and also at the General Assembly. And areas of collaboration or participation for people in the audience, and including with national human rights institutions, we see it in two main areas. One, through our annual thematic reports and the call for submissions that we make to all actors, states, national human rights institutions, civil society organizations, and in this year, in the issue that I mentioned, that is particularly, we think, relevant for women's in fisheries. And the other is through the complaint mechanism. I mentioned before that we issue communications, so through the complaint mechanism, people can send us what they have documented as violations of human rights, in our case of women and girls in the area of fisheries. And I would maybe end with an invitation to everyone, and including my other colleagues from treaty bodies and special procedures, that is to also look at all of these issues with a gendered perspective, which I know they do, and to do it even more and more deeply, to recommend maybe obviously participation and representation of women, including gender parity or prioritizing gender parity in decision-making bodies. And secondly, and lastly, also promoting participation of girls. This is something that the working group has been proactively doing, not only from its report of last year dedicated to activism of girls and young women, but also in our daily activities. We have tried to incorporate the voices of girls, including from indigenous communities, from disadvantaged sectors of the population, from fisheries communities, to try to really give them a voice and also elevate their concerns at the global level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Dorothea Estrada, and thank you to all the three speakers for this first segment. It was very valuable and full of a wealth of good information. I think I would like to highlight the warm invitations that you gave out to civil society, to NHRIs, and to each other, to the other parts of the United Nations mechanisms, to engage with you, to support each other in the different areas of your work, through information sharing, through communicating human rights violations and the monitoring activities that you do, and also through promoting the voices of small-scale fisher and their communities, and the voices of women and girls also in this work. Thank you very, very much. And I would like to give the floor to Ms. Carol Rask, Chief Advisor at the Danish Institute for Human Rights, for continuing the facilitation for the second segment. Thank you, everybody, and let's start the second segment. Thank you.
Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. So thank you very much for that very rich exchange by the distinguished panelists from the International Human Rights Mechanisms. I think we got a very, very good introduction to the type of work that the international mechanisms are already doing, their recommendations, and also importantly, some of the new opportunities for working more with the mechanisms to get more recommendations, concluding observations in relation to this particular issue. So at the same time, we also heard from the International Human Rights Mechanisms. I think many of them said that they are also very open and quite dependent as well on information received. Mr. Michael Winfor pointed particularly to the options or the possibilities of influencing list of issues from a very early stage, so that the issues of human rights and fisheries are integrated in their consideration. So what I would like to do now in this section is to maybe dig a little deeper into how other actors, the national human rights institutions and others, have actually engaged with human rights mechanisms, but also what is the potential for this future engagement. So our first speaker is William Salazar from the National Human Rights Institution in Colombia. William works as an advisor for the delegate on agricultural and land issues at the Colombian Defensoría del Pueblo, the NHRI of Colombia. A very warm welcome to you, William, and thank you for joining us rather early in Colombia. Just to say that William will be speaking in Spanish, so those needing translation, please find the interpretation app for interpretation to English. So, William, Colombia has not, as far as we have seen, received either recommendations from treaty bodies or the Universal Periodic Review on human rights and fisheries. We do, however, note a very recent communication from a number of UN special rapporteurs that include a number of concerns regarding the situation of indigenous fishers in the old Providencia and Santa Catalina Islands in Colombia. William, also from what we have earlier heard in the previous segment, how could your current work in Colombia on the issue of human rights and fisheries potentially support the work of UN mechanisms in this regard? William, the virtual floor is yours. Please.
Muy buenos días. Primero, bueno, me presento, soy William Salazar. Soy servidor público de la Defensoría del Pueblo en Colombia. Primero agradecer que nos permitan estar en este espacio, también el apoyo que hemos venido recibiendo como Defensoría del Pueblo de Colombia del Instituto Danés de Derechos Humanos y de este importante asunto que nos convoca hoy. La pesca artesanal en Colombia se encuentra en una crisis por varios factores sociales, económicos, políticos, pero especialmente por los fuertes impactos que el cambio climático está provocando en los entornos acuáticos donde las comunidades de pescadores desarrollan sus actividades. Desde la década de los 60, las condiciones de vida de las comunidades ribereñas y costeras se han transformado rápidamente y en la actualidad existen grandes impedimentos para la garantía de derechos humanos de las comunidades dedicadas a la pesca artesanal. Actualmente en Colombia se estima que hay 280.000 familias dedicadas en Colombia a la pesca artesanal, de las cuales 70.000 están en las áreas ribereñas, 15.000 en los valles de los ríos Sinú, San Jorge, y hay 29.000 dedicadas a la pesca en las costas del Pacífico y el Atlántico en Colombia. Los pescadores habitan lugares que son acuatorios, lugares que son importantes para la vida y el agua de los territorios. Y son esos entornos que no solo aseguran los medios de vida para las comunidades de pescadores, sino que también tienen una importancia para la protección ambiental en Colombia. Lamentablemente en Colombia las familias de pescadores se encuentran en el último eslabón de acceso a derechos y vida digna en Colombia. La Defensoría del Pueblo en Colombia desde hace 4 años ha venido adelantando una estrategia para que se reconozcan los derechos de los pescadores artesanales, para que sean reconocidos como sujetos de especial protección constitucional. Y en esa perspectiva publicó una cartilla de derechos de pescadores, de comunidades de pescadores a pequeña escala, comunidades de pescadores, que ha permitido que se visibilice ese reconocimiento de derechos de las comunidades de pescadores ante las autoridades públicas, pero también como una herramienta para que las comunidades de pescadores artesanales exijan ante las autoridades públicas del gobierno nacional en Colombia sus derechos. Eso ha permitido hacer visible esta situación y ha permitido también que las autoridades públicas reconozcan sus derechos. Actualmente hemos logrado que a través de una tutela que instauró una pequeña comunidad de pescadores en el Magdalena, en Colombia, fuera seleccionada por la Alta Corte Constitucional, que es la máxima corte y tiene la salvaguarda de protección de los derechos humanos en Colombia. Esta tutela, esta pequeña comunidad es muy importante porque se va a poder lograr proteger un cuerpo de agua muy importante donde desarrollan la actividad de la pesca de las comunidades, pero sobre todo porque son cuerpos de agua fundamentales para la vida de las especies animales y vegetales y para las sociedades humanas asentadas a su alrededor. Sin embargo, a pesar de los esfuerzos que hemos hecho desde la Defensoría del Pueblo en Colombia, de la cartilla, de las acciones que hemos hecho ante la Alta Corte, no contamos aún con recomendaciones en el orden internacional que los sistemas regionales e internacionales de derechos humanos emitan recomendaciones en favor de las comunidades de pescadores en Colombia. Es muy importante entonces que estos múltiples factores que amenazan y ponen en riesgo los derechos y medios de vida de las comunidades de pescadores artesanales en Colombia, como la pérdida de cobertura natural de bosques, humedales, litorales, manglares, corales, y sobre todo que hay grandes obras de infraestructura de desarrollo que están afectando gravemente a las comunidades, se requiere activar mecanismos y recomendaciones de los sistemas internacionales de derechos humanos al Estado colombiano para la protección y reconocimiento de derechos de las comunidades dedicadas a la pesca artesanal o en pequeña escala, que soportan graves vulnerabilidades y violaciones de sus derechos fundamentales y que afecta siempre a los más vulnerables, que son en este caso las mujeres y los niños y niñas de estas comunidades que se dedican a esta importante actividad. Por eso agradecemos este espacio y lograr que se emitan esas recomendaciones para que el Estado colombiano brinde y adopte medidas de protección a estas familias dedicadas a la pesca artesanal a pequeña escala. Muchas gracias, Carol.
Thank you very much, William, for providing us very concrete proposals or concrete ideas of how the Defensoría has worked on this issue. Just linking it to some discussions yesterday, the important work that national human rights institutions are doing with communities through outreach, through awareness raising on their rights, and also in relation to access to remedies. Also, I also hear a call from you that to have more recommendations from the international and regional bodies on this issue. And again, I think we also had an invitation earlier by the bodies to also be sanitarized, providing them with more information from the national context, so that they can also make these very clear recommendations. So thank you very much for that intervention, William. So now moving from Colombia now to Rome, I think. I would like to welcome Ana Suarez Dusan. Thank you, Ana, for joining us today. Anna works as a human rights specialist at the Food and Agricultural Organization in Rome. Anna, we heard yesterday about the important guidelines developed by FAO, the voluntary guidelines for securing sustainable small-scale fisheries in the context of food security and poverty eradication. And the whole objective of these guidelines are to through a human rights-based approach to achieve more sustainable small-scale fisheries. So any project or program supporting small-scale fisheries then needs to promote and protect the international human rights standards as per the human rights-based approach, including empowering small-scale fishers to hold their national authorities to account, as we also heard some examples yesterday. So Anna, as a key actor in this area with considerable expertise, could you share with us some examples of how FAO has engaged with international human rights actors and promoted a human rights-based approach to small-scale fisheries? The virtual floor is yours, Anna.
Thank you very much for that question, Carol. Good afternoon to everyone, or good morning in Colombia, and everyone in Latin America or the America that are connecting now. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this crucial event. In relation to fisheries, FAO is in many ways on a collective learning path with its partners about applying the human rights-based approach. After the endorsement of the small-scale fisheries guidelines, as you mentioned, in 2014, we held a first workshop with different stakeholders on exploring the human rights-based approach in the context of implementing the small-scale fisheries guidelines. And we tried to understand in this workshop the meaning of the human rights-based approach in the context of the different thematic areas of the guidelines, and concluded that the diversity of rights that relate to small-scale fisheries, the integrated relationships among the multiple actors, and the complexity of addressing structural problems in the sector called for a joint effort and specific guidance on the application of the approach in implementing the small-scale fisheries guidelines. Since then, this is something we have tried to work on, engaging with various international human rights actors. Within the UN system, for instance, FAO has worked with the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, and this has led to a joint publication on the relationship between the governance of small-scale fisheries and the realization of the right to adequate food in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals, and to the organization of side events on human rights and small-scale fisheries at the Committee on Food Security. More recently, the International Year of Artisanal Fisheries and Aquaculture, IAFA, in 2022, provided a unique opportunity to advance the recognition, protection, and promotion of small-scale fisheries human rights. And for this, FAO joined forces with the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights and with the One Ocean Hub. And we organized a virtual roundtable at the World Oceans Week to explore the challenges, opportunities, and partnerships among various stakeholders, including small-scale fishers, and across different levels of governance. The event included the first ever message delivered by the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights during the World Oceans Week, and the participation of the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, who spoke about the interdependence between human rights of small-scale fishers and the environment. And this event showed the need to build a network of international organizations, practitioners, researchers, and fishers to advance in the understanding of small-scale fishers' human rights in general, how to protect them, but also how to empower small-scale fishers to claim these rights, as well as the need to clarify the responsibilities of different actors. We plan to continue this engagement with other special rapporteurs on this subject. We're in discussions with the current special rapporteur on the right to food, Michael, who's here with us today. And this collaboration with the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights and the One Ocean Hub also produced a brief on applying coherently the human rights-based approach to small-scale fisheries for achieving sustainable development goals, which aims to clarify the scope of the human rights-based approach, including the obligations of different actors, and highlight how the protection of these rights support the realization of multiple SDGs. I will leave all the links to all the events and publications on the chat. And of course, we're also collaborating with the Danish Institute for Human Rights. We contributed to two expert meetings they organized in 2019 in the African and Asian region, with national human rights institutions and other international organizations to explore how national human rights institutions are engaging with the fisheries sector according to their mandate, and so some of the examples that were presented here yesterday. And we're also collaborating with the Danish Institute in response to a recommendation from last year's UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues to produce a study on the impacts of industrial fishing on traditional fishing. So a lot remains to be done, and we as FAO hope to be able to deliver on our core functions of gathering and sharing information, assisting our members in implementing normative instruments and sharing good practices. In 2024, we will celebrate the 10-year anniversary of the small-scale fisheries guidelines. And this will be an important collective opportunity to take stock of what we have learned so far and how we can move forward. Thank you very much, Carol.
Thank you very much, Anna, for those very concrete examples of how the FAO has engaged also in this, as you described, learning journey of securing a human rights-based approach to the issue of small-scale fisheries. I also noted your conclusion that there is a need for a collective effort with many different actors involved, and FAO is already engaging with a number of them to secure that the protection and promotion of human rights in this sector. And also, pleased to see also national human rights institutions also being included as well in this group. So thanks to both William and Anna for these examples. I hope they have given us a sense of what some actors are doing, and also the potential for more collaboration around this issue, working more together to strengthen recommendations and not least national implementation and the protection and promotion of the human rights of small-scale fishes in the countries where they are. I would like now to move to the third segment of our webinar today. We would like to begin to now have a discussion. We've had a lot of really great input from our panelists from the UN human rights mechanisms, now also some different actors who have engaged or would like to engage with the system. We invite everyone to use the chat to share your reflections and recommendations. We will take as many comments from the virtual floor as we can in the time that we now have, about 25 minutes. But to help kickstart this discussion while you are all writing all your questions, we've invited a few people to say a few words. We would ask discussants to really keep to 3 minutes, as we really would like to have a discussion. So I'd like to start by welcoming our first discussant, Sophie Guidel Hansen, my colleague in the Danish Institute for Human Rights. Sophie is an advisor at the Institute. Sophie, as part of the Institute's work on human rights and fisheries, the Institute has studied the concluding observations and recommendations from international bodies that specifically address fishers and fisheries. We also heard from, at least from the Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, some examples as well. But what has been the Institute's key findings in terms of the quantity of recommendations across the board, but also the types of issues raised by these bodies, and also maybe you could provide some recommendations for next steps. Sophie, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm sitting next to Carol, so I'm borrowing your mic. Yeah, so to help kickstart the discussions, very few points. We have used one of the tools that we have developed here at the Institute, which is the Human Rights Data Explorer. With this Explorer, we can dive into some of the all-including observations and recommendations, more or less, from treaty bodies, as well as from special procedures when they do country visits. What we can see out of 200,000 of these type of recommendations and observations, around 73 are addressing fisheries and human rights. This number is growing, and this number does not include the communication, and it does not include the thematic report, just to make that clear. But we're happy to see that the number is growing, and we can also see that most 38 of these observations and recommendations are coming from treaty bodies, with 28 from special procedures and only six from the Universal Periodic Review mechanisms. And when we then look across on what are the rights mentioned, we have already mentioned them yesterday and they've been mentioned today. It's mainly rights related to tenure and to land and natural resources, the right to an adequate standard of living, and to food and cultural rights and rights of indigenous peoples, as well as the right to equality and non-discrimination. What is gaining more inclusion and more focus is related to working conditions and also the right to work. We're seeing some more focused on the right to a healthy environment and more of the procedural rights, participation and consultation, as well as protection from displacement. And the issues you know on access to land, water, and resources, and we're seeing some very interesting recommendations on fisheries agreement and climate change, which has been highlighted. So when we look into what could be next in having more discussions and focus, I would say first 3 points here. First point is to look at more countries. So far, we can see 22 countries in the database. We know that small-scale fisheries livelihood issues is a global phenomenon, and from FAO, we have the numbers of the number of people around the world dependent on fisheries. So we can do more looking at more countries. And also we can consider more rights to be discussed and under scrutiny, such as the right to social security, more focus on child labor and forced labor, and more focus also on the access to remedy, as we heard coming out yesterday strongly. And finally, when we look at the factors and the issues causing violations, we need to look at fisheries subsidies. We need to look at broader projects for development, including exploitation of natural resources, the implications from tourism and from conservation, pollution, and also really at the final point, business and human rights. We see the UN guiding principles have not yet really been applied and widely used in the fisheries sector. So that's also important. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Sophie, for giving this overview of the important contribution by human rights bodies, but also pointing to where there could be future opportunities for a bit more emphasis. So with that, I would like to invite our second discussant, Dr. Elaine Webster from the University of Strathclyde in Scotland and One Ocean Hub. One Ocean Hub is one of the co-sponsors of this series, and it is a program of research for sustainable development, working to promote fair and inclusive decision-making for a healthy ocean, whereby people and the planet can flourish. So, Elaine, after listening to the speakers today and also Sophie's review about where do you think there's a need for additional or more guidance from the UN human rights mechanisms? Elaine, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Carol, and it's wonderful to be here and to listen to all of these contributions. I think what we've seen from the presentations today is that there is already a hugely substantial baseline of knowledge that frames small-scale fisheries and human rights terms that has really developed over the past 20 years in collaboration with civil society. And we've seen evidence today of the ways in which that is ongoing, which is hugely encouraging. I think in terms of additional guidance or what more the international mechanisms could do, I think more of the work to build synergies across the framework of international human rights law. Seeing the range of standards and with the legally binding standards at the heart of those, I think really adds weight to the priority that needs to be given by states in their national fisheries management, but also in their international engagements to human rights law. And by international engagements, I'm thinking of, for example, the World Trade Organization and also the International Seabed Authority. I think additional guidance would be helpful, in particular on the full range of state duties under international human rights law, including the duties to protect and fulfill human rights. Anything that can really consolidate those duties would be valuable to support national implementation and also valuable to support the work of civil society and academics in feeding in that evidence base to the work of the UN mechanisms. Because there are several other international legal regimes relevant to the small-scale fisheries sectors, the more we can have a clear picture of the consolidated duties under human rights law, then I think the easier it will be to understand how we can support a coherent interpretation and implementation of those duties across the relevant international legal regimes, including human rights law. And finally, I just want to pick up on the point about environmental human rights defenders, which was raised. Mr. Thackeray used the term stewards. I think there is a role for the international mechanisms to support the recognition and hopefully the safeguarding of small-scale fisher activists who may be acting as environmental human rights defenders. The international level acknowledgement could help to put pressure on national states for change in this respect and to give that recognition that in many cases small-scale fishers may be acting in the service of human rights, and not only to protect their own rights, but also to protect the human rights of everyone in some cases. And I think that's something that really comes out of our research in the One Ocean Hub, is that because of the connectivity of ocean health impacts, action to protect local marine environments can also contribute to the protection of the rights of everyone, including, of course, everyone's right to a healthy environment. I'll stop there, Carol.
Thank you very much for that excellent contribution, Elaine. Both a call to have a more consolidated overview of the human rights obligations in this sector that would be extremely useful as we navigate various international legal regimes as well. And also a call for more recognition of the fishers as working to defend human rights, not only for themselves but for many others. I think those are really important points to take with us. And then I would like to now welcome our third and last discussant, Balorti Gorme from Hinpoenoa Civil Society Organization from Ghana, working with fisheries. Balorti, can you hear me? Can you give some examples of or suggestions of how civil society organizations can work with international human rights mechanisms to raise human rights issues facing small-scale fisheries? I think we've heard a number of calls from the international mechanisms for more information, and it would be great to hear your view on how civil society organizations can do this. The floor is yours, Balorti.
Thank you very much.
I'm sorry, but would you mind just adjusting your camera a little bit so that we can see you? Excellent. Very good. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Indeed, there are so many obstacles and, of course, opportunities. In the first place, we need to, first of all, identify those rights. And in Ghana, unlike Latin America and other countries where you had indigenous populations, in Ghana, for example, and many African countries, we don't have indigenous, so everybody is an indigene, and we find ourselves in the regions where you were born or where you travel to work and all those things. Now, in terms of human rights violations in the fisheries sector, I think apparently one of the discussants mentioned it, that there are two critical issues here. We don't have a problem with access because in the fisheries sector, we have open access regime. However, the small-scale fisheries sector faces many problems. First, it is genderly segregated. That is to say, men involved in the main harvesting of fishing, and then the women get involved in the processing and then sale of fish. In the course of these duties, of course, with the dwindling stock,
sorry, Balorti, are you with us? It seems that we have lost Balorti. We will try and see if we can get him online again. But maybe I will go straight to the discussion. And I think we heard from Sophie, and we also heard from Elaine. So Sophie mentioned all the observations and recommendations that we have seen coming from mechanisms, but also mentioned in her suggestions it would be good for more countries. Oh, I can see Ms. Balorti, Mr. Balorti, are you back?
Yes, I'm back.
Okay. Would you like to finish up what your introduction?
Yeah. And so we have two main CLAT, that is child labor and trafficking in fisheries, and also hello.
Yes. We can hear you. We can hear you.
We have child labor and trafficking and sexually based gender violence perpetrated against especially women and, of course, children. Hello.
Yes, we can hear you. Please continue. We can hear you.
Yes, and these are the major issues. Now, the question is, what can we do? Civil society groups, what we do is that we research and identify where the problems are and try to work with institutions, especially national institutions and then international organizations, of course, for sponsorship, to be able to reach out to victims, to be able to reach out to communities, create awareness on these violations. And we try to solve some of these problems, but of course, talking to law enforcement agencies, government department, of course. The government of Ghana has many instruments, legal instruments. They have policies and all those things, but of course, these things have not been effectively implemented. And so civil society groups, on basis of not at a national scale, but maybe at the regional scale, we are able to reach out to these women, identify them, create the awareness, conduct the research, and so that we identify the problems. And we can actually work with international when there is what? The partnerships or linkages, or there are communication channels through which we can make our work available, or hold discussions with our partners, international partners, on some of these issues, so that even if we feed them with reports of work that we are doing, at least they will be able to get information or understand what we are doing and the context in which we approach human rights violations, especially when it comes to the fishery sector. For example, currently we're doing work in CLAT, that is child labor and trafficking in most fishing communities, and also gender-based violence. And we try to reach out, fortunately with the support of the United States Agency for Development, USAID, and also the European Union, we are able to reach out. But of course, we end at what? Reporting to these organizations. But it will be important that we establish the linkage, the collaboration, so that those of us on the ground here, especially in Africa, where information flow is not the best, so that they understand the significance of the problem, the challenges faced by our people, and how to address them. Thank you. Hello.
Yes, thank you very much for that. Also highlighting the amount of information and documentation that you have as a civil society organization, and again, how this can, if presented to the international human rights mechanisms, could also inform some of the observations and recommendations coming from the system as well. So now I want to take a few questions from the audience, from the participants, and there is one question which I will address to Michael Winfur. If you are, yes, you're still here with us, Michael. The question from the audience is, what can be done in cases where states have not ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights? Are there other mechanisms that you would suggest to hold states accountable, particularly in relation to the fishery sector? Michael?
Yes, thanks. Well, to be clear, we have already 171 signatures, yeah, and the US will be the last to sign the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. If you remember the discussion about the health insurance in the US, but you can still use everything which has been developed as maybe guidance from our committee. The discussion of a general comment on right to food with the differentiation of the different levels of state obligations. You can use the categories which we have used, and you can use it in national context as, let's say, the opinion of human rights expert in that field. Yeah, and I think it has been totally reflected in the work of the special rapporteurs on the right to food. Since they have started, there's a consistent application of these terms. And I think it has also been reflected in all the FAO instruments, from the right to food guidelines up to the guidelines on responsible governance of tenure of land, forest, and fisheries, and the small-scale fisheries guidelines. So there's a consistent application of these standards. And it makes clear that these economic, social, cultural rights has been developed over the last years, and you can apply it to concrete situations. And there are obligations of the state to respect, protect, fulfill. And there is also an obligation for extraterritorial application. You can just deplete the resources of another country by sending your own fishing vessels and things like that. So I think with these categories, you have really a good armament for any argument, yeah, which we can use. Maybe this would be my answer, yeah. And well, definitely you can also make sure that the US is signing this Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights. But yeah, it might take some time, yeah.
Thank you very much, Michael, also for those recommendations, and also pointing out this is the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Treaty is a treaty that's actually very widely ratified by states. I have maybe another question to the some of the panelists from the first panel. I don't know which one of you would like to address it, but I think we heard from Dr. Elaine Webster about the need for some kind of consolidated overview of the obligations in relation to human rights and fisheries. What opportunities do you see? And I'm speaking to you, Michael, and the special rapporteur, and also to you from the working group on women and girls. What potential do you see from the international mechanism side to do this type of overview? I'm not sure which of you would like to take this. Will you?
Maybe I'll just start very briefly. So I really...
And I follow.
Thank Dr. Webster for her guidance. I mean, this is the exact thing I've been looking for in terms of what is needed. And as I mentioned, with this upcoming report we're working on over the next year, and we're still finalizing the details on expert meetings and consultations and guidance. So I think the report that me and my team are working on over the year can provide that sort of framework. And like Michael said, there's a lot of tools. The tools are there, the mechanisms are there, the language is there, there's a lot of power there. But most importantly, I think also I would add the challenge. You can have the best laws in the world. That's not, I mean, sure, you can have the most beautiful constitution. You can have food sovereignty dictating everything. What's more important in my mind are, and I see this in the work of the One Ocean Hub, I mean, this is just building on their approach. It's the campaigns, it's the legal campaigns that the fisher groups are building around their specific context, combined with the fact that there's good, excellent global forums for fishers as well. So the social movements are strong, the legal tools are there, and I think it's just continuing that momentum. But this is the point I think Dr. Webster highlighted. It's the challenge is this fragmented international system. It's investment law, it's trade law, it's international law of the sea. So that's what I took her comments, is taking this strong, I would say already coherent momentum and outlining maybe more the duties of states. That's a point well taken. But understanding how this relates to all this other stuff. And that's a challenge. I think the classic way from a human rights approach is to say, human rights is more important. Sure, that's one argument. But I think thinking more coherently in terms of the political economy and the cultural context as the starting point, and looking, sometimes human rights does fall short in many ways in understanding its limitations. So just a point well taken by Dr. Webster. I really appreciated her advice and suggestion. And I want to recognize the good work already done and sort of add that hopefully we can continue collaborating. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I just continue and very briefly.
Please do.
Yeah, very briefly. I think the special rapporteur's next year's report is a good opportunity to summarize, maybe from a resource. Sorry, I give you this task, a short summary of the duties which we have in all the documents which has been shared, and particularly in the seminar also from small-scale fisheries and human rights, which was organized by the FAO already in 2014, which is a very good document, and also the material from the Danish Institute. So maybe if you could highlight this, yeah? And then we can discuss, Michael, maybe we can do it also together. If we as a committee can also maybe make a statement in linked to when you publish your report, maybe half a year later, just to reiterate things, yeah, and we look for a good opportunity to make it, yeah. So a statement is something lesser than a general comment because it takes a lot of time, but a statement, we did several ones on, and we could take up the description of duties, maybe, that if that would be helpful. But I agree with you, we have a consistent application of these standards developed in the last years, which can already be used, yeah, and it's good movements who use this application of standards, yeah. But maybe the two of us, you in your report and we with a statement, can highlight it a bit more. That can be useful for everybody. It would be great, yeah.
Thanks to Michael and Michael for this very concrete proposal for how we can take one of these, the suggestions coming from this webinar to have this more consolidated obligation. And Ms. Ispada Tank, would you like to contribute with some last comments to this issue.
Thank you, Carol. Yes, thank you, Carol, and thank you to Dr. Webster, yes, for that advice on clarifying these consolidated duties. And I think we also find tools that maybe have been subutilized in international human rights law to give this coherent perspective. I'm thinking that Michael Thackeray was talking about. I'm thinking, for instance, of the basic obligations of equality and non-discrimination, progressive realization of economic, social, and cultural rights, non-regressivity, the obligation of international assistance and cooperation, which is not only a matter of right to development or of general goodwill, but it's a specific obligation in the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Article 28 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights on creating an international environment that is conducive to human rights realization. So I think we can also, in a way, rescue and highlight and bring to the fore these human rights obligations in all these other fields that were being mentioned: tax law, investment law, global trade rules. So this is part of what we're trying to do as well, and I'm glad to see that we can bring efforts together. So what does this mean in terms of states' obligations when they negotiate a bilateral investment treaty or a regional treaty or a free trade agreement? What do these human rights obligations mean when they engage in these other types of negotiations, seemingly isolated from human rights obligations, but when they are really not? The other point that we see specifically to our mandate is that with the gender backlash and really the questioning of basic concepts such as sexual and gender-based violence, or even intersectional discrimination at a more general level, not only related to women and girls, we really also see the need to going back to this very basic ABC of international human rights law and saying how this is the cornerstone, this is the fundamental pillar of the whole system. I mean, I had an experience once in discussions in the Commission on Food Security, where they told me this is Rome and human rights is Geneva, and you know, Universal Declaration of Human Rights is something in Geneva. And I almost couldn't believe my ears that this is the basic foundation of the whole UN system. So I think we really need to reinforce and reaffirm that, and also rescue social mobilization that was being mentioned before. Girl activists, for instance, really empower also girls and young people, and also rescue regional traditions. For example, if we think of the interdependence that has been seen in the inter-American system from many years ago between economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights, los DESCA, ¿no? Derechos económicos, sociales, culturales, y ambientales, as one whole, understanding these linkages that were mentioned by several of you between these rights and the right to a healthy environment and sustainable development. So I think we can look at this coherent and integral way, again, going back to these basics and really reaffirming them and standing together.
Thank you for those really strong suggestions, Mrs. Strada-Tank. And I see we're at the end of the webinar, even though I think we could have spent another hour discussing these very rich issues. I just want to say thank you very much for all of our panelists from the UN system, from Colombia, from Rome. We found this an extremely rich exchange, and I think it's been very clear. There are standards out there. There are observations and recommendations that have been produced that we can use. Of course, there are areas where we can do more. And we also heard of the very, very important proposal that can we now have some consolidate overview of the duties. I think this is really important around human rights and fisheries. So thank you very much for attending today, and we really look forward to continuing the discussion in other fora. Goodbye for now.